During my time as a competitive cosplayer, I've entered many different types of costumes. Yet, whether it be a tailoring project or even a little bit of armor work, I found that a certain type of cosplay always did very well in competition. This being the idol costume. Characterized by their fluffy skirts, large bows, and over-the-top frills, it was as if these costumes had a chokehold on the competitive cosplay community. But why? Let's just say I wanted answers. So when I found this official art of Katusha from one of my favorite animes, Girls in Panzer, I knew I needed to try my hand at one of these costumes. This was probably the most hectic cosplay construction I've ever had, as I had to completely remake the cosplay with materials that I had on hand. While initially I wanted to use a sequence and dye it the olive green, due to extreme complications when dyeing, I couldn't get the fabric the right color and I had to scrap the project. I ended up using our literal living room curtain. It so happened to be the right color and I had just barely enough to finish the project. Which means this cosplay is made out of mostly thrifted material. Repeating the process you saw before on the replacement curtain, the fabric was a bit delicate and needed to be handled with care, especially in ironing. I also had some rips from where it once hung. After I cut out my pieces, it was time for me to prepare the gold trim. This also happened to be a challenge due to the poor quality of the material. I ended up having to cover the entire trim with Mod Podge to keep it from fraying. The front panel had quilting batting put in the center to give it a stiffness, and then I sewed it on. Finally, I started my lining. With recent competition builds, I've had a goal of having a completely clean inside, so I referenced historical fashion to make this bodice look as couture as possible, not to mention to add stability for my dance. Now using this red velvet curtain, I created the collar and the cuffs. Given the fragile nature of the fabric, the stiffener I used was attached through machine. Feel free to pause on these pictures as this is my cleanest project to date. I quickly want to talk about this hem as it took me 15 hours to do. I wanted to add bugle beads to the trim to add an extra detail, but I also had to whip stitch my fashion fabric down by hand. If you saw with the diagram, then you know I had to whip stitch a segment and then do the bugle beads on the other side and repeat the process. Without a doubt, one of the most important things about these idol costumes is the structural undergarments beneath them, for this is what gives them their iconic shape and movement. As you can see in my performance, the skirt moves quite a lot and it was a lot of fun to wear around the convention, but how do these skirts work? These garments usually consist of 3 layers, 4 if you count the bloomers: the petticoat, the underskirt, and the fashion skirt. While I don't have a lot of progress shots of this cosplay, without a doubt the petticoat was a game changer. This was definitely a challenge as I rarely work with tulle, so I ended up having to use some from a wedding dress. I even got to redeem myself with my dye project. While before the skirt already had a decent volume, as you can see, these undergarments are absolutely necessary. Not to mention, they add a ton of value when it comes to craftsmanship. But more on that later. What shocked me the most when creating these garments was the amount of material that I had to use. While the overskirt is just a circle skirt, the petticoat consisted over 10 yards of fabric. And you'll see later, I only created 2 tiers with that fabric. However, many of these undergarments, considering the shape, can have 4 tiers of fabric with over 200 yards. In this video, I'm just sewing on a decorative trim, which was a definite must, and highly recommended for competition projects. Thankfully, I had this amazing tutorial by Kirilee Cosplay. Please check it out if you plan on making a petticoat of your own. This video is incredibly helpful, link down in the description. As I stated before, I only had 2 tiers to my petticoat, and the whole thing ended up being about 10 yards of fabric. Another undergarment you should definitely consider. Considering with how fluffy and bouncy these skirts are, you're going to be able to see underneath them, so bloomers I think are a definite must. Also, the petticoats add a bit of modesty. They fill in the gap between the skirt and your legs. Even though you can still see the bloomers underneath, it definitely felt nice and cozy. First, starting with how I made the bows. I followed a pattern for a waterfall tail tutorial I saw on YouTube. Then I copied that onto interfacing. I did the same for both parts of the bows and the smaller one you see on the front. I made sure I added some trim and I ended up having to put a wooden dowel through the center to keep it upright. Katusha's tights were pretty simple. I started with this tan pair of shorts and these pleather jeggings that were too big on me, so I cut them down to size. This way, I don't have to worry about the thigh-high stockings falling down during my performance. Katusha's boots were one of the more challenging parts of the cosplay. I created my pattern with cling wrap and painter's tape, then traced it onto the suede fabric. The fabric will then be attached to halfway down the front of the shoe. Then I repeated the process with my lining. Once those two were sewn together, I added some zip ties as a boning to keep the grommets from tearing. I dyed the shoes with leather dye, and here's what they looked like before. I added a bit of trim to keep the transition seamless. This was my first time doing a major shoe modification, and I'm proud of how they turned out. I created the belt buckle out of silicone beads and a silicone cake mold. I placed the silicone beads into the cake mold, boiled some water, and let it melt into shape. This is also how I made the scroll work. Finally, I cut some leftover pleather and dyed it black. I hammered small rivets around one side of the belt and buckle, and the other side is velcroed into place. Now for one of my favorite parts of the cosplay, the flag. Initially, I wanted to paint this, but I felt that I didn't have enough time, so I designed something on IBIS Paint and then had it custom printed. Now for the hat. This is one of my favorite parts of the cosplay. I created a base using quilting batting and wire, and then added the fabric over it. Finally, I did a hand-beaded trim and created the star on the front using pearl. I started with this base wig of which I got on Amazon. Next, I crimped the wig to add volume. While the rest of this wig was the right length, I had to cut the bangs. To begin styling, I teased the bangs, having them curl upwards. Next, I split them into sections and cut and molded them into the desired shape. I really wanted to create a one-for-one of Katusha's hairstyle, and that includes all the jagged bangs. I also tried on the wig regularly to make sure the bangs would fit my face proportions. Lastly, I gave a wave to the bottom of the wig and continued to mold the bottom. And with that, the wig is complete. Now for one of the most important elements of any cosplay, the embellishments. This cosplay has over 36 hours of beading total. Whether it be the small tanks surrounding the skirt, or the large KV2 on the back of the bow. The embellishments are one of the most important parts of Masters level cosplays, and I was really excited to experiment with it here. I designed all the tanks on IBIS paint, and then printed them out with transfer paper onto some fabric. Finally, following the design, I beaded over it. I did these for all of the designs except for the star on the hat. As mentioned before, I used bugle beads around the hem, but I also did this on my hat with small red beads. There was also scroll work casted out of silicone beads on the epaulettes and other places of the costume like the belt buckle. Now, like I said in my intro, I've competed with a lot of different types of costumes, yet I've been commonly beat out by the idol type. This includes Sailor Moon costumes, Madoka Magica, Hatsune Miku, or any cosplay that shares the traits of big petticoats, large bows, and over-the-top frills. This led me to developing a bit of a conspiracy theory. At first I wondered if it was just the anime community's mass hysteria over kawaii-ness, but as I became a more seasoned seamstress, I realized the true formula. You see, the cosplay creation process for sewing can be split into two parts, patterning and constructing the garments versus embellishing them. While it'd be half-witted to claim that all idol costumes are similar in their pattern, for me this was a basic bodice as well as a circle skirt, and for a seasoned seamstress, these types of garments are easy to replicate, especially for those who specialize in this type of sewing. Therefore, the actual construction period is quite small compared to the embellishment period, again for the seasoned seamstress. However, on the contrary, these types of costumes aren't majorly demanding for a beginner to make, and it can be a great learning point. Another thing that judges particularly like, and that was a massive learning curve for me, was making all the undergarments. Particularly the petticoat. This was the first time I worked with tulle, and I found it extremely challenging, but it was something I was able to learn, and I'm extremely proud of. Throughout this, I was able to figure out where the craftsmanship on these costumes really lie. It's not just the pretty dress you see on the front, it's also the structural undergarments and the amount of quality you add to them. For the craftsmanship element of masquerades, you are not judged on necessarily the amount of work you do, but how clean your work is executed. Idol costumes are a great way to add a lot of elements to a cosplay, yet for a beginner sewer to learn the basics of sewing, then for a more seasoned seamstress to test their accuracy, and still have time for embellishments. While my Katusha cosplay is heavily embellished with beadwork, I still had plenty of time to finish the garments ornately, so this is the conclusion I came to. Since the construction time is not only shorter, but allows for a larger expression of precision in different areas, especially compared to a more straightforward design, it also allows embellishments to be done ornately and even experimentally. As you get to higher levels of competitive cosplay, you'll find that embellishment is what really brings a cosplay to the top. This is something that can majorly be expressed, especially with magical girl costumes, as they're supposed to be very glamorous. And as I stated before, for a seasoned seamstress, the construction period being more straightforward allows for a larger amount of time to embellish. Therefore, more craftsmanship value can be added in a shorter amount of time. So, did this conspiracy end up being true? I competed with this cosplay also using another advantage to the idol cosplay, that being the ability to perform a perky and attention-grabbing routine. So, did this cosplay win? No. A different idol-style costume won.